The silence was absolute. Not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but the terrifying stillness that comes when tons of snow have swallowed everything whole. 3 miles beneath the surface of the Cascade Mountains, Sarah Mitchell lay trapped, in a pocket of air no bigger than a coffin, her breath creating the only warmth in a frozen tomb. Above her, rescuers had already called off the search. But 800 miles away in Monument Valley, an elderly Navajo man named Joseph Begay was having dreams that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always been drawn to the mountains. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, she spent her weekends hiking the trails of Mount Hood, her summers working as a backcountry guide, and her winters teaching advanced skiing techniques at Timberline Lodge. At 28, she was the kind of person who understood snow, like others, understood city streets, reading its moods, recognizing its dangers, respecting its power. That morning in late February, Sarah had set out alone for what should have been a routine backcountry ski tour in the Cascade Range. The weather reports showed stable conditions, and she'd skied this particular route dozens of times before. The area, known locally as Eagle's Crown, offered some of the most pristine powder skiing in the Pacific Northwest, but it also demanded respect. Sarah carried Avalanche safety equipment, a beacon, probe, and shovel, along with emergency supplies that could sustain her for 3 days if needed. The morning started perfectly. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, leaving a pristine blanket across the landscape. Sarah's skis cut through the powder like a knife through silk, each turn sending up clouds of diamond dust that sparkled in the early sunlight. She followed her usual route up the backside of Eagle's Crown, a challenging but familiar path that would take her to the summit ridge. As she climbed higher, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the snowpack. The wind had been working overnight, creating small drifts and cornices along the ridgeline. Nothing immediately dangerous, but enough to make her more cautious than usual. She stopped frequently to test the snow's stability, digging small pits and examining the layers beneath the surface. Everything seemed solid. What Sarah couldn't see was the deeper weakness in the snowpack, a layer of sugar snow that had formed weeks earlier during a period of extreme cold. This layer, buried 3 feet beneath the surface, was like a house of cards waiting for the right trigger to collapse. The fresh snow from the night before had added just enough weight to bring the entire slope to the breaking point. She had reached the summit of Eagle's Crown and was preparing for her descent when it happened. Sarah had chosen a northeast-facing slope for her first run, a wide bowl that offered nearly 1,000 vertical feet of untracked powder. She dropped in cautiously, making her first few turns slowly to test the snow's reaction. The mountain gave no warning. The fracture line appeared instantly, running horizontally across the slope like a crack in glass. Sarah felt the snow beneath her feet suddenly become liquid, unstable, alive with motion. She tried to ski out of the avalanche's path, angling toward a cluster of trees that might provide shelter. But the moving snow was already too fast, too powerful. Within seconds, Sarah was swept off her feet and carried downward by thousands of tons of snow moving at highway speeds. She fought to stay on the surface, swimming through the churning white chaos. But the avalanche had its own agenda. The snow poured over her like concrete, heavy and unforgiving. Her avalanche training kicked in. Sarah managed to activate her emergency beacon just before the snow buried her completely. She tried to create an air pocket around her face as the avalanche slowed and began to set like concrete around her body. The weight was immense, pressing against her chest, making each breath a struggle. When the mountain finally stopped moving, Sarah found herself in complete darkness, buried under an estimated 15 feet of snow. The avalanche had carried her nearly 800 feet down the slope, depositing her in a narrow gully that was now completely filled with debris. Above her, the snow had settled into a dense, heavy mass that would be nearly impossible to dig through without heavy equipment. But Sarah was alive. The air pocket she had managed to create was small but sufficient, giving her perhaps a few hours of breathable air if she remained calm and controlled her breathing. Her body was pinned in an awkward position, her left arm trapped beneath her torso, her legs bent at uncomfortable angles. She could barely move, but she was conscious and aware. The first few hours were the hardest. Sarah fought against panic, knowing that elevated breathing would consume her limited oxygen more quickly. She forced herself to think logically, to assess her situation and consider her options. Her avalanche beacon was still functioning. She could hear its steady beeping, which meant rescue teams would be able to locate her if they were searching. But as the hours passed and no sounds of rescue reached her ears, Sarah began to realize the gravity of her situation. She had been skiing alone, which meant no one would report her missing until she failed to return home that evening. Even then, the search would likely focus on the more popular and accessible areas first. Eagle's Crown was remote, and Avalanche. Conditions would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. The cold was relentless. Despite her high-quality winter gear, the temperature in her snow cave was well below freezing. Sarah could feel her extremities beginning to numb, and she worked constantly to move her fingers and toes to maintain circulation. She rationed her emergency food and water, knowing she might need to survive for days rather than hours. On the second day, Sarah heard the distant sound of helicopters. Her heart leaped with hope, and she shouted as loudly as she could, though she knew the sound would never penetrate the dense snow above her. The helicopters passed overhead several times, but their search patterns seemed to be focused on areas closer to the main ski routes. By the third day, the helicopter sounds had stopped. Sarah understood what this meant. The active search and rescue operation had been called off. In avalanche situations, the chances of survival dropped dramatically after the first 24 hours, and rescue teams couldn't justify the risk to their own personnel for what was likely a body recovery operation. Sarah had never felt so alone. The silence around her was complete, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the occasional settling of snow above her. She began to wonder if this frozen tomb would be her final resting place, if her family would ever know what had happened to her. But Sarah Mitchell was not ready to give up. She had survived 3 days already, longer than most avalanche victims. Her emergency supplies were running low, but she still had some food and water left. More importantly, she had her determination and her knowledge of survival techniques. She began to dig, using her one free hand and a small emergency shovel from her pack. Sarah started the painstaking process of trying to create more space around her body. The snow was dense and heavy, but she worked methodically, removing small amounts at a time and packing it into unused corners of her cave. The work was exhausting, and Sarah had to rest frequently to conserve her strength and oxygen. But gradually, she managed to create a slightly larger space, enough to change her position and relieve the pressure on her trapped arm. She also began to dig upward, though she knew the chances of reaching the surface were slim. Meanwhile, 800 miles away in the red rock country of Monument Valley, Joseph Begay was experiencing dreams unlike any he had known in his 73 years. Joseph was a respected elder among his people, known for his spiritual insights and his ability to walk between the worlds of the living and the spirits. The Navajo tradition spoke of those who could see beyond the veil of ordinary reality, and Joseph had always possessed this gift. The dreams had started the same night Sarah was buried. Joseph saw flashes of white, overwhelming cold, and a young woman's face streaked with tears and determination. At first, he dismissed the visions as fragments of his own imagination, perhaps influenced by a news report he had seen about winter storms in the northwest. But the dreams persisted, growing stronger and more detailed each night. Joseph saw the woman clearly now, her brown hair, her determined green eyes, the way she moved with the confidence of someone who knew the mountains intimately. He saw her trapped beneath the snow, struggling to survive in conditions that would have killed most people within hours. More importantly, Joseph began to see the location. In his dreams, he soared above the landscape like an eagle, seeing the mountain from angles impossible for earthbound eyes. He saw the specific slope where the avalanche had occurred, the gully where Sarah lay buried, even the pattern of debris that marked the avalanche's path. Joseph had experienced prophetic dreams before, but never with such clarity or urgency. He understood that he was being called to act, that somehow this young woman's survival depended on his ability to bridge the gap between the spirit world and the physical realm. On the fourth day after the avalanche, Joseph made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't understand the depth of Navajo's spiritual tradition. He gathered his medicine bundle, performed the necessary rituals, and prepared to undertake a journey that would test the limits of his abilities and his faith. Sarah, meanwhile, was entering her most critical phase. Her food was nearly gone, her water supply reduced to a few sips. The constant cold was sapping her strength, and she found herself sleeping more frequently, her body's way of conserving energy. She knew that hypothermia was setting in, and that each period of unconsciousness might be her last, but something was changing in her dreams. Instead of the nightmares of suffocation and cold death that had plagued her earlier, Sarah began to experience visions of warmth and light. She saw an elderly Native American man with kind eyes and weathered hands, speaking to her in a language she didn't understand but somehow comprehended. The man seemed to be guiding her, showing her how to conserve her strength and maintain her will to live. In these dreams, Sarah felt a presence beside her in the snow cave, a comforting warmth that made the cold seem less threatening. She began to believe that she was not truly alone, that somehow her survival was connected to forces beyond her understanding. The connection between Sarah and Joseph was growing stronger, though neither fully understood what was happening. Joseph's dreams were becoming more vivid and detailed, while Sarah's visions were providing her with the spiritual strength she needed to continue fighting for her life. But time was running out. Sarah's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, and even her extraordinary will to survive might not be enough to overcome the brutal realities of her situation. She needed rescue, and she needed it soon. Joseph understood this urgency. In his dreams, he could see Sarah's growing weakness, could sense that her time was measured in hours rather than days. He knew that he had to find a way to guide rescuers to her location, to somehow communicate what he was seeing to people who lived in a world of technology and logic rather than spirits and visions. The stage was set for an extraordinary convergence of ancient wisdom and modern rescue techniques, of spiritual insight and physical determination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's survival would depend not just on her own strength and skill, but on the ability of an elderly Navajo man to bridge two worlds and bring help to a young woman he had never met, but whose life had become as important to him as his own. The mountain held its secrets, but Joseph Begay was preparing to unlock them in ways that would challenge everything the rescue teams thought they knew about finding the lost and bringing them home. Joseph Begay stood at the edge of Monument Valley as dawn painted the sandstone. Formations in shades of gold and crimson, the sacred landscape stretched before him, a testament to the enduring power of the earth itself. But his mind was focused on a place hundreds of miles away, where winter held dominion and a young woman fought for her life beneath tons of snow. The dreams had evolved beyond simple visions. Joseph now experienced what his grandfather had called spirit walking, the ability to project consciousness across vast distances, to see through eyes that existed beyond the physical world. It was a gift that came with great responsibility and greater risk. Too long in the spirit realm, and one might never find the way back to their own body. Joseph had spent the morning in preparation, gathering items that would anchor him to this world while allowing his spirit to travel. Eagle feathers blessed by his grandmother 50 years ago, turquoise stones that had been in his family for generations, sacred corn pollen that connected him to the earth's life force. Each item carried power, but more importantly, each carried the accumulated prayers and intentions of his ancestors. His granddaughter, Maria Begay, watched from the doorway of their modest house. At 35, Maria worked as a nurse at the Indian Health Service clinic in Kayenta, bridging the gap between traditional healing and modern medicine. She understood both worlds, which made her one of the few people who didn't question her grandfather's abilities. "You're going to try to reach her again," Maria said. It wasn't a question. Joseph nodded, his weathered hands carefully arranging the sacred objects in a precise pattern on a Navajo rug that had been woven by his wife before her death. She's running out of time. Her spirit is strong, but her body is failing. Maria had grown up hearing stories of Joseph's spiritual journeys, but she had never seen him undertake anything this ambitious. The idea of projecting consciousness across such a vast distance, of maintaining contact with someone he had never met, pushed the boundaries even of traditional Navajo spirituality. "What if you can't find your way back?" Maria asked, voicing the fear that both of them carried. Joseph's eyes met hers, and she saw the depth of his commitment. "Then I will have honored the spirits who called me to this work, but I will return, granddaughter. This woman's survival is connected to something larger than either of us understand." Meanwhile, in her frozen prison beneath the Cascade Mountains, Sarah was experiencing changes that defied medical explanation. Her body should have succumbed to hypothermia days ago. Her oxygen supply should have been exhausted. Yet somehow she remained conscious and alert, sustained by forces she couldn't comprehend. The visions of the elderly Native American man had become more frequent and more detailed. In these spiritual encounters, he spoke to her in English, his voice carrying the weight of decades and the wisdom of countless generations. "You must conserve your strength," he told her during one particularly vivid vision. "Help is coming, but you must survive until it arrives." Sarah found herself following his guidance instinctively. When her body wanted to panic, his calm presence soothed her fears. When the cold threatened to overwhelm her, she felt warmth radiating from his spirit. Most remarkably, he seemed to know exactly what she needed to do to maximize her chances of survival. "Dig toward the northeast corner of your space," he instructed during another vision. "There is a weakness in the snow formation there." Sarah had no idea how he could know such specific details about her situation, but she followed his advice. Her small emergency shovel met less resistance in that direction, and she managed to create a slightly larger air pocket that improved her breathing. Back in Monument Valley, Joseph had entered the deepest meditative state of his life. His consciousness floated free from his physical body, soaring across the landscape like the hawks that circled above the mesas. The journey to the Cascade Mountains should have been impossible, but ancient pathways of spiritual energy connected, all sacred places, and Joseph knew how to follow these invisible roads. He found Sarah's location with an accuracy that would have amazed GPS technology. Her life force glowed like a beacon in the spiritual realm, a bright point of determination surrounded by the cold darkness of her tomb. But Joseph could see that her physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her body temperature was dangerously low, and her breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. More concerning was what Joseph sensed above the Avalanche site. The rescue operation had indeed been called off, but not because the authorities had given up hope. The mountain was unstable, threatening new avalanches that could bury additional victims. The risk to rescue personnel was simply too great to justify continuing the search. Joseph understood that conventional rescue methods would not reach Sarah in time. But the spirit world operated by different rules, and he had access to allies that existed beyond the physical plane. In Navajo tradition, the spirits of animals often served as guides and messengers. Joseph called upon the spirit of the bear, known for its ability to survive in the harshest winter conditions. He summoned the eagle, whose eyes could see from great distances and whose wings could carry messages across vast spaces. Most importantly, he reached out to the spirits of his own ancestors, those who had walked the path between worlds before him. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Joseph felt the presence of his grandfather, who had taught him the old ways. His grandmother's spirit wrapped around him like a warm blanket, providing protection for his journey. Other ancestors, stretching back through generations of Navajo healers and spiritual leaders, added their strength to his efforts. With this spiritual support, Joseph began the most challenging part of his mission. He needed to communicate Sarah's exact location to people in the physical world, people who might not believe in visions or spiritual guidance, but who had the equipment and expertise needed for rescue. The solution came through Maria. As a nurse, she had professional contacts throughout the Southwest, including emergency medical personnel who worked with mountain rescue teams. More importantly, she understood how to translate her grandfather's spiritual insights into language that modern rescuers could accept and act upon. Joseph's spirit body hovered above the avalanche site, memorizing every detail of the terrain. He noted the specific ridge lines, the configuration of trees, the angle of the slope, even the pattern of wind-sculpted snow formations. When he returned to his physical body, he would need to provide Maria with information precise enough to guide helicopters to the exact location. But first, he had another task. Sarah's spirit was beginning to separate from her physical body, a natural process as hypothermia progressed. Joseph had to find a way to anchor her consciousness to the world of the living, to give her the spiritual strength needed to survive until rescue arrived. The connection between them had grown stronger with each vision. Joseph could now communicate with Sarah almost as easily as if they were sitting in the same room. He found her spirit floating in a grey space between life and death, her determination wavering as her body's resources reached their limits. "You cannot leave yet," Joseph told her, his spirit voice carrying absolute authority. "Your work in this world is not finished." Sarah's spirit turned toward him, and for the first time she saw him clearly, not as a dream figure or a hallucination, but as a real person whose consciousness had somehow bridged impossible distances to reach her. "Who are you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't fit into any category her rational mind could accept. "I am Joseph Begay of the Navajo Nation," he replied. "I am the one who will guide your rescuers to this place, but you must hold on. You must return to your body and fight to stay alive." The spiritual realm in which they met was timeless, but Joseph was acutely aware that every moment spent here corresponded to precious seconds in the physical world. Sarah's body was shutting down, preparing for the final surrender to cold and exhaustion. Joseph made a decision that would have profound consequences for both of them. He reached deep into his own life force, drawing upon spiritual energy that had taken decades to accumulate, and transferred some of it directly to Sarah. The process was dangerous. Giving too much could kill him, While giving too little might not save her, the transfer felt like lightning passing between them. Sarah's spirit suddenly blazed with renewed vitality, while Joseph felt a corresponding drain on his own essence. But the gamble worked. Sarah's consciousness snapped back into her physical body with shocking intensity, bringing with it the spiritual energy needed to restart her failing biological systems. In her snow cave, Sarah gasped as warmth flooded through her limbs. Her heart rate, which had slowed to dangerous levels, picked up its rhythm. The numbness in her extremities receded as circulation improved. Most remarkably, her mental clarity returned with startling sharpness. She understood now that her survival was connected to forces beyond her comprehension, that somehow an elderly Navajo man she had never met was risking his own life to keep her alive. The knowledge should have seemed impossible, but Sarah's experience over the past few days had pushed her far beyond the boundaries of rational thought. Back in Monument Valley, Joseph's physical body slumped forward as his spirit returned from its journey. Maria rushed to his side, checking his pulse and breathing with professional efficiency. His vital signs were weak but stable, though she could see that the spiritual effort had aged him years in a matter of hours. "Grandfather, are you all right?" she asked, helping him sit up and wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. Joseph's eyes focused slowly, the process of reintegrating spirit and body always disorienting after such an intense journey. But when he looked at Maria, his gaze was sharp and urgent. "Get me a map of the Cascade Mountains in Washington state," he said, "and find someone who can contact mountain rescue teams in that area. I know exactly where she is." Maria didn't question the request. She had seen enough of her grandfather's spiritual work to trust his insights completely. Within an hour, she had contacted Dr. Rebecca Chen, a physician who worked with wilderness rescue operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Chen had worked with Maria on several emergency medical cases involving Native American patients, and she respected the integration of traditional and modern healing approaches. The conversation was delicate. Maria had to convey Joseph's visions in terms that a rational, scientifically minded doctor could accept without dismissing them outright. She focused on the specific geographic details that Joseph had observed, presenting them as information from a reliable source familiar with the area. Dr. Chen was initially skeptical, but the precision of the location data was impressive. Joseph had provided coordinates, topographic features, and visual landmarks with an accuracy that suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain. More importantly, the location was in an area that rescue teams hadn't thoroughly searched, focusing instead on more accessible slopes closer to established ski routes. "This information is remarkably detailed," Dr. Chen admitted during their phone conversation. "But you have to understand, the avalanche danger in that area is extreme. We can't risk additional lives based on what might be a false lead." Maria understood the physician's caution, but she also knew that Sarah's time was running out. Joseph's spiritual intervention had given her additional strength, but it was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. "Dr. Chen," Maria said, "I know this sounds unconventional, but my grandfather has never been wrong about these matters. If he says there's someone alive at those coordinates, then there is. The question is whether you're willing to consider methods of confirmation that go beyond traditional search techniques." The suggestion intrigued Dr. Chen. As a wilderness medicine specialist, she had encountered numerous cases where conventional wisdom proved inadequate, where survival stories defied medical explanation. She had learned to remain open to possibilities that couldn't be easily categorized or understood. "What kind of confirmation are you talking about?" she asked. Maria took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either convince Dr. Chen or end the conversation entirely. My grandfather believes he can provide real-time information about the victim's condition and exact location. Information that could be verified by technical means if rescue teams are willing to investigate. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Dr. Chen spoke, her voice carefully measured. "I'm going to make some calls," she said. "I can't promise anything, but if your grandfather's information is as accurate as you claim, there might be a way to verify it without putting anyone at risk." As Maria ended the call, she looked at Joseph with a mixture of admiration and concern. The spiritual energy he had transferred to Sarah had visibly weakened him, and she worried about the long-term effects of such an intense metaphysical effort. But Joseph's expression remained determined. "The hardest part is still ahead," he told her. "Keeping her alive was only the beginning. Now we must guide her rescuers through dangers they cannot see, and we must do it before my connection to her spirit realm becomes too weak to maintain." In the Cascade Mountains, Sarah felt the renewed strength flowing through her body, but she also sensed the fragility of her situation. The spiritual energy that Joseph had shared with her was like a candle flame in a hurricane, bright and warm, but easily extinguished if not carefully protected. She began to prepare for what she somehow knew would be her final test. Rescue was coming, but the mountain had not finished with her yet. The forces that had buried her were still active, still dangerous, and they would not give up their prisoner without one last, devastating challenge. Dr. Rebecca Chen stared at the topographic map spread across her desk in the Seattle Mountain Rescue Headquarters, her finger tracing the coordinates that Maria Begay had provided. The location was in one of the most treacherous sections of the Cascade Range, an area where even experienced mountaineers proceeded with extreme caution. Yet something about the precision of the information nagged at her scientific mind. 24 hours had passed since her conversation with Maria, and Dr. Chen had spent that time making careful inquiries. She had contacted the original search and rescue coordinator for the Sarah Mitchell case, Captain David Torres of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. Torres had reluctantly agreed to meet, though he made it clear that he considered the official. "Search concluded. We deployed every resource available," Torres explained as they reviewed the search records. "Helicopters, ground teams, avalanche dogs, probe lines. The avalanche debris field covers nearly 40 acres, and the snow depth in some areas exceeds 20 feet. We found her abandoned ski equipment near the fracture line, but no other trace." Dr. Chen spread Joseph's hand-drawn map alongside the official search grid. The elderly Navajo man had somehow provided details that matched the topographic surveys, with startling accuracy, including features that weren't visible on standard maps. "What about this area here?" she asked, pointing to a narrow gully that Joseph had specifically identified. "Your search pattern seems to have bypassed this section entirely." Torres studied the map with growing interest. "That's because Avalanche. Forecasters classified it as extremely high risk. The snow conditions there are so unstable that even helicopter rotor wash could trigger secondary slides. We couldn't justify sending teams into an area where the probability of additional casualties was higher than the chance of finding survivors." "But what if someone had specific intelligence about a survivor's location?" Dr. Chen pressed. "Intelligence accurate enough to minimize exposure time and risk?" Torres looked at her sharply. "What kind of intelligence? Are we talking about phone signals, emergency beacons, some kind of technical data I'm not aware of?" Dr. Chen had rehearsed this moment, knowing that the credibility of her entire proposal depended on how she presented Joseph's unconventional methods. "We have a source with intimate knowledge of the terrain who believes he can provide real-time information about survivor location and condition." "I know that sounds vague, but the geographic data he's already provided is remarkably accurate." "Dr. Chen," Torres said carefully. "I've been in search and rescue for 15 years. I've seen families hire psychics, dowsers and fortune tellers when conventional methods fail. I understand the desperation, but I can't risk personnel based on paranormal claims." "I'm not asking you to," Dr. Chen replied, "but I am asking you to consider a limited reconnaissance mission, low-risk aerial survey using thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar. If this source is accurate, we should be able to detect signs of life without putting anyone in danger." The conversation might have ended there, but Torres received an unexpected phone call that changed everything. The caller was Commander Lisa Park from the Army National Guard's High Altitude Rescue Team, a specialized unit trained for extreme mountain operations. "Dave, I heard about the Mitchell case through channels," Park said. "I know you've officially concluded the search, but we've got a training exercise scheduled in the Cascades next week. If you've got any leads worth investigating, we could incorporate them into our mission profile." Torres looked at Dr. Chen, weighing risks against possibilities. The National Guard team had equipment and expertise that civilian rescue operations couldn't match. More importantly, their training mission meant they were already planning to operate in hazardous conditions. "Lisa, I might have something," Torres said, "but it's unconventional, and I need guarantees that your people understand the risks involved." Meanwhile, in Monument Valley, Joseph's condition had stabilized, but Maria could see that maintaining his spiritual connection with Sarah was taking a severe toll. He spent most of his time in deep meditation, his consciousness flickering between worlds like a radio signal, struggling to maintain contact across vast distances. "She's getting weaker again," Joseph told Maria during one of his brief periods of full awareness. "The energy I shared with her is fading, and her body is reaching its absolute limits. If rescue doesn't come within the next day, nothing I can do will keep her alive." Maria had been monitoring the rescue coordination through her contacts, and she knew that wheels were finally beginning to turn. But the process seemed agonizingly slow compared to the urgency of Sarah's situation. "Grandfather, maybe you should reduce the spiritual contact," she suggested. "You're wearing yourself out trying to sustain her from this distance." Joseph's eyes flashed with determination. "If I break the connection now, she dies. Her survival depends on more than just physical endurance. She needs spiritual anchor points to keep her consciousness from drifting away. I am that anchor." In her snow tomb, Sarah was experiencing phenomena that challenged every assumption she had about reality. The conversations with Joseph had evolved beyond simple visions into what felt like actual presence. She could sense his personality, his deep wellspring of compassion, even his growing physical weakness as he maintained their impossible connection. But Joseph wasn't her only spiritual visitor. Other presences had begun appearing in her frozen world, figures that she somehow recognized as Joseph's ancestors, spirits who had joined their energy to his in order to sustain her life. The experience should have been terrifying, but instead it filled her with profound peace. One presence in particular seemed familiar, though Sarah couldn't understand why. An elderly Native American woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who spoke to her in a mixture of English and what Sarah assumed was Navajo. "You have been chosen for this trial," the woman's spirit told her. "Not as punishment, but as preparation. Your survival will create ripples that extend far beyond your own life." Sarah wanted to ask what she meant, but communication in the spirit realm operated by different rules than normal conversation. Understanding came through intuition rather than explanation, and Sarah gradually began to comprehend that her ordeal was connected to something larger than personal survival. The woman's spirit, whom Sarah somehow knew was Joseph's grandmother, showed her visions of the future. Images of Sarah speaking to groups of people, sharing her story, bridging gaps between different ways of understanding the world. The visions suggested that her survival would somehow help others navigate their own impossible challenges. Back in Seattle, the reconnaissance mission was taking shape with military precision. Commander Park had assembled a 4-person team equipped with the most advanced search technology available. Thermal imaging cameras capable of detecting body heat through 20 feet of snow. Ground-penetrating radar that could map underground spaces. Most importantly, specialized Avalanche safety equipment that would allow rapid extraction if conditions deteriorated. Dr. Chen had arranged for Maria to be present during the mission, serving as an intermediary for Joseph's ongoing spiritual intelligence. The arrangement was unprecedented in military rescue operations, but Commander Park had dealt with enough extreme situations to remain open to unconventional approaches. "I don't pretend to understand how your grandfather is getting his information," Park told Maria during the mission briefing. "But if he can guide us to the right location and help us avoid unnecessary risks, I'm willing to work with whatever methods produce results." The team assembled at dawn on a clear, cold morning that offered optimal flying conditions. 2 helicopters would participate in the operation, a lead aircraft carrying the search team and equipment, and a backup helicopter positioned to provide immediate extraction if the mission encountered problems. As the helicopters lifted off from their base near Seattle, Joseph entered the deepest meditative state of his life. His consciousness soared alongside the aircraft, serving as a spiritual guide for the technological search that was about to begin. Sarah felt the approaching rescue team before any of their equipment detected her. The spiritual connection that had sustained her for days suddenly blazed with renewed intensity, as if Joseph was channeling every remaining fragment of his life force into keeping her alive for these crucial moments. "They're coming," Joseph's spirit voice whispered to her, "but the mountain is not finished with its tests. You must be ready for one final challenge." Sarah didn't understand what he meant until she heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The snow around her began to shift and settle, and she realized, with growing horror, that another avalanche was building somewhere above her position. The rescue helicopters had reached the search area and were beginning their systematic sweep when their instruments detected the same ominous signs. Snow layers that had been stable for days were suddenly showing signs of movement. The entire mountainside was awakening, as if disturbed by the aircraft's presence. "We've got unstable conditions developing," the lead pilot reported. "Recommend immediate withdrawal to safe distance." But Joseph's spiritual reconnaissance had revealed something that the rescue team's instruments couldn't detect. The impending avalanche would actually improve Sarah's chances of survival by shifting the snow formations around her burial site. The challenge was timing the rescue to take advantage of this brief window of opportunity. Through Maria, Joseph provided precise instructions to the search team. "The avalanche will occur in approximately 4 minutes, she relayed. "But it will expose a section of the debris field where thermal imaging will be able to detect the survivor. You'll have less than 60 seconds to mark the location before conditions become too dangerous to remain in the area." Commander Park had to make a split-second decision that would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. Trust the unconventional intelligence source and position her team to take advantage of the predicted avalanche, or follow standard safety protocols and withdraw immediately. The rumbling grew louder, and everyone involved, the rescue team, hovering above the mountain, Maria and Joseph hundreds of miles away in Monument Valley, and Sarah buried beneath tons of snow, understood that the next few minutes would determine not just the success of the rescue mission, but the survival of everyone involved. Joseph's consciousness stretched to its absolute limits as he tried to coordinate between the spiritual and physical realms. He could see the avalanche beginning to release, could sense Sarah's exact location, could feel the rescue team's uncertainty and fear. But he could also feel his own spiritual energy reaching the point of complete exhaustion. In her frozen tomb, Sarah felt the mountain beginning to move again. But this time, instead of terror, she experienced something approaching gratitude. She understood now that every moment of her ordeal had been preparation for this instant, that her survival had always depended on forces and timing beyond human control. The avalanche began with a sound like thunder, and Sarah closed her eyes, trusting in the spiritual guidance that had sustained her through the impossible, preparing for whatever final test the mountain had prepared for her and her rescuers. The secondary avalanche struck with devastating force, sending thousands of tons of snow cascading down the mountainside in a thunderous display of nature's raw power. Commander Park's helicopter bucked violently in the turbulent air created by the moving snow, while her pilot fought to maintain position despite the aircraft's proximity to catastrophic conditions. "Thermal signature detected," shouted Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the team's technical specialist, his eyes locked on the imaging display. Grid reference 77 Alpha, approximately 18 feet down. The heat signature is weak but consistent with human body temperature. The avalanche had done exactly what Joseph predicted. The massive snow displacement had compressed and shifted the debris field, creating a temporary thermal window that revealed Sarah's location. But that same avalanche had also destabilized the entire mountainside, creating conditions so dangerous that standard rescue protocols would have mandated immediate evacuation. Park had seconds to make a decision that would haunt her regardless of the outcome. Deploy her team into the active avalanche zone for a rapid extraction attempt, or mark the coordinates and withdraw, knowing that another opportunity might never come. "Rodriguez, how long do we have before the thermal signature disappears?" she demanded. "The snow settlement will close the thermal gap in approximately 90 seconds, he replied, his voice tight with concentration. "After that, we won't be able to detect her again." In Monument Valley, Joseph felt the mountain's fury through his spiritual connection, experiencing the avalanche as if he were physically present on the slope. The massive energy release sent shockwaves through the spiritual realm, threatening to sever his connection with Sarah at the most critical moment. Maria watched her grandfather's physical body convulse as his consciousness struggled to maintain its hold across impossible distances. His vital signs were becoming erratic, and she prepared emergency medical interventions while simultaneously relaying information between Joseph and the rescue team. "Tell them they have 45 seconds once the thermal signature stabilizes," Maria transmitted to Dr. Chen, who was coordinating communications from the rescue command center. "After that, the spiritual connection will be too weak to maintain guidance." The urgency in her voice conveyed what everyone involved understood but couldn't afford to acknowledge. If this rescue attempt failed, both Sarah and Joseph might die in the next few minutes. Below the chaos of the rescue operation, Sarah experienced the second avalanche as a strange liberation. The massive snow movement had shifted her prison, creating slightly more space around her body and, more importantly, allowing fresh air to penetrate her tomb for the first time in days. But the relief was overshadowed by her growing awareness of Joseph's deteriorating condition. Their spiritual connection had become so intimate that she could feel his life force ebbing, could sense his physical body reaching the limits of endurance. She understood that he was literally giving his life to maintain the guidance that would lead rescuers to her location. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me," she whispered into the darkness, knowing somehow that Joseph would hear her across the vast distance that separated them. Joseph's spirit voice reached her with effort that was painful to witness. "My time in this world was already measured in seasons, not years, but your time has only begun. Accept this gift and make it worthy of the cost." The exchange crystallized something profound for Sarah. Her survival wasn't just about personal endurance anymore. It had become a sacred trust, a responsibility to honor the sacrifice being made on her behalf by a man she had never physically met, but who had become closer to her than family. Above the Avalanche zone, Commander Park made her decision with the cold calculation that defined military leadership. Deployment team, prepare for emergency extraction. We're going in. The helicopter descended through air still filled with snow particles and ice crystals, its rotor wash creating additional instability in the already precarious snowpack. Park's team had trained for extreme conditions, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for attempting a rescue in the middle of an active avalanche zone, guided by spiritual intelligence from 800 miles away. Sergeant Rodriguez monitored multiple instrument readings simultaneously, calling out coordinates and depth measurements while watching for signs of additional slope failure. Target is 19 feet down. Stable heat signature, no movement detected. Recommend probe deployment at grid 77 Alpha 3. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, the team's Alpine Rescue Specialist, rappelled from the helicopter with equipment designed for rapid snow excavation. Her probe rod struck something solid at the predicted depth, not rock or debris, but the distinctive resistance of compacted snow around a void space. Contact, Walsh reported. Confirmed cavity at 18.7 feet, deploying the rescue shaft. The excavation equipment looked like something from a mining operation rather than a traditional rescue. Heated augers designed to bore through ice and compress snow. Portable pneumatic systems that could clear debris faster than human hands. And most critically, breathing apparatus that could be threaded down narrow shafts to provide life support. During extraction, as Walsh worked, the mountain continued its ominous settling, creating sounds like distant thunder that reminded everyone of their precarious situation. Each minute in the avalanche zone exponentially increased the risk of catastrophic slope failure that could bury the rescue team alongside their target. In her tomb, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of mechanized drilling, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from directly above her position. Hope flooded through her for the first time in days, but it was tempered by her awareness of the enormous risks her rescuers were taking. Through Joseph's spiritual connection, she could sense the rescue team's tension, their professional competence, balanced against their very human fear of the unstable mountain. More disturbingly, she could feel Joseph's consciousness beginning to fragment as his physical body approached complete exhaustion. "They're close," Joseph's spirit voice told her, weaker now than at any time since their first contact. "But I cannot maintain the connection much longer. You must guide them for the final approach." Sarah didn't understand what he meant until she realized that her own spiritual awareness had been enhanced by days of contact with Joseph's consciousness. She could now sense the rescue team's location relative to her position, could feel the direction and distance of their excavation efforts. Working together across the boundary between physical and spiritual realms, Sarah and Joseph provided guidance that enabled Walsh to adjust her drilling angle by crucial degrees, avoiding a section of debris that would have blocked the rescue shaft, and instead finding the optimal path to Sarah's air pocket. At 3:47 p.m., exactly 6 days after the original Avalanche, Walsh's probe rod broke through into Sarah's tomb. The first breath of outside air that reached Sarah's lungs carried with it the promise of life, and the proof that the impossible had somehow become reality. "Survivor contact confirmed," Walsh reported. "She's conscious and responsive." The breakthrough moment created a surge of energy that reached across the continent to Monument Valley, where Joseph experienced it as a flash of pure joy that momentarily restored his failing strength. But the effort required to maintain spiritual guidance through the final extraction phase would demand everything he had left. Dr. Chen, monitoring the rescue from the command center, coordinated the complex logistics of bringing Sarah to the surface. Medical equipment had to be lowered through the narrow shaft, including heated oxygen to prevent shock from the temperature, differential and IV fluids to combat severe dehydration. Sarah's first words to her rescuers were not about her own condition, but about the man who had made the rescue possible. "There's a Navajo elder named Joseph Begay who guided you here," she told Walsh through the communication system. "He's risking his life to maintain spiritual contact. Please tell them to check on his condition." The request seemed surreal in the context of a technical rescue operation, but Walsh had learned to trust information that came from survivors, regardless of how unusual it might seem. She relayed Sarah's message to the command center, where Dr. Chen immediately contacted Maria in Monument Valley. The news was not encouraging. Joseph had lost consciousness during the final phase of the rescue, and Maria was preparing to transport him to the Indian Health Service hospital in Kayenta. His vital signs were stable but weak, and his condition remained critical. Sarah's extraction required another hour of careful work, as Walsh and her team gradually enlarged the rescue shaft and prepared Sarah's severely weakened body for the transition from her snow tomb to the outside world. Throughout the process, Sarah maintained an almost supernatural awareness of the rescue team's efforts, as if Joseph's spiritual guidance had permanently enhanced her connection to the environment around her. When Sarah finally emerged from her tomb, carried in a rescue litter to the waiting medical helicopter, the first thing she saw was the avalanche-scarred mountainside that had held her prisoner for 6 days. The sight should have filled her with trauma and relief, but instead she felt something approaching gratitude. The ordeal had changed her in ways that went far beyond physical survival. She had experienced direct contact with spiritual forces that most people would consider fictional, had participated in a rescue that bridged ancient wisdom and modern technology, and had formed a connection with another human being that transcended normal understanding of human relationships. As the medical helicopter lifted off from the mountain, carrying Sarah toward the trauma center in Seattle, she maintained her spiritual awareness of Joseph's condition 800 miles away. She could feel his life force stabilizing now that the enormous effort of maintaining their connection was no longer necessary, but she could also sense that the experience had fundamentally altered him. Dr. Chen rode in the medical helicopter, monitoring Sarah's condition during transport. Despite 6 days of extreme hypothermia, dehydration, and oxygen deprivation, Sarah's vital signs were remarkably stable. Her recovery defied medical explanation, as if she had been sustained by forces that operated outside normal physiological parameters. "How did you survive?" Dr. Chen asked during a moment when Sarah was fully alert. Sarah's answer would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the events of the past week. "I had help," she said simply. "Help from someone who understood that some rescues require more than technology and training." The helicopter approached Seattle as the sun set behind the Olympic Mountains, carrying a survivor whose story would challenge fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between possible and impossible, between individual survival and collective spiritual effort, between the realm of science and the domain of faith. But Sarah's rescue was only the beginning of a larger story. In Monument Valley, Joseph Begay was beginning his own journey back from the edge of death, while in Seattle, Sarah was preparing to face questions about her survival that would force her to articulate experiences that had no precedent in normal human discourse. The mountain had tested both of them beyond their limits and found them worthy of survival. Now they would have to learn how to live with the knowledge of what they had shared and how to honor the spiritual forces that had made their impossible connection a reality that saved 2 lives across a distance that should have made any contact. Unthinkable, the convergence of ancient wisdom and modern rescue techniques had succeeded, but the consequences of that success would ripple outward in ways that none of the participants could fully anticipate or control. 3 weeks after her rescue, Sarah Mitchell sat in the neuropsychology wing of Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, undergoing tests that physicians hoped would explain her impossible survival. Dr. Amanda Foster, the lead researcher studying Sarah's case, had never encountered anything comparable in 2 decades of treating extreme survival cases. "Your brain scans show patterns I've never seen before," Dr. Foster explained, pointing to colorful images on her computer screen. "The areas associated with spatial awareness and long-distance perception are showing activity levels that shouldn't be possible. It's as if your rescue experience fundamentally altered your neurological functioning." Sarah studied the brain scans with fascination rather than concern. The changes Dr. Foster described matched her own perception of the world since emerging from the mountain. She could sense weather patterns days before they arrived, could detect underground water sources while hiking, and most remarkably, maintained a persistent awareness of Joseph Begay's condition despite the vast distance separating them. However, "You considered that maybe some experiences change us in ways that science hasn't learned to measure yet?" Sarah asked. Dr. Foster paused in her explanation, struck by the calm certainty in Sarah's voice. Most extreme survival patients showed signs of trauma, hypervigilance, and anxiety disorders. Sarah exhibited none of these symptoms. Instead, she displayed an almost preternatural serenity, as if her ordeal had granted her access to sources of peace that most people never discovered. Meanwhile, 800 miles away in Monument Valley, Joseph Begay was experiencing his own form of recovery. The spiritual effort required to maintain contact with Sarah had pushed him closer to death than any of his previous spirit walks. But it had also opened pathways of consciousness that he was still learning to navigate. Maria found her grandfather, sitting on the mesa behind their house, watching the sunrise paint the ancient sandstone formations in shades of gold and crimson. His physical recovery had been remarkably rapid, but she could see that the experience had changed him in profound ways. "The dreams are different now," Joseph told her as she joined him on the rocky outcrop. "Before, I could see across distances and into other times, but it required great effort. Now, the visions come naturally, like looking through a window that never closes." "Is that a blessing or a burden?" Maria asked, settling beside him on the warm stone. Joseph considered the question, with the careful deliberation that characterized all his responses to spiritual matters. "Both, granddaughter. I can see Sarah's path clearly now, and it is remarkable, but I can also see many others who will need guidance, and I am not certain how many more journeys this old body can endure." In Seattle, Sarah had begun documenting her experiences for what would eventually become a book that challenged conventional understanding of human survival capabilities. But her primary focus was on establishing contact with Joseph Begay, the man who had literally saved her life through methods that defied scientific explanation. The logistics of their first face-to-face meeting required delicate coordination. Sarah's doctors were reluctant to authorize travel so soon after her ordeal, while Joseph's family worried about the stress of such an encounter on his still fragile health. Dr. Chen, who had facilitated the original rescue, finally proposed a solution that satisfied everyone's concerns. "What if we arranged the meeting here in Seattle?" she suggested during a conference call that included Sarah, Maria, and several medical professionals. We could provide medical support for both participants and document the interaction for research purposes. The proposal intrigued Dr. Foster, who was eager to study the neurological effects of reuniting two people who had shared such an intense spiritual connection. She arranged for Sarah and Joseph to meet at the university's consciousness research laboratory, where their interaction could be monitored using advanced brain imaging technology. 2 days later, Joseph arrived in Seattle, accompanied by Maria and Dr. Thomas White Eagle, a Navajo physician who specialized in integrating traditional healing with modern medicine. The cultural contrast between Monument Valley and urban Seattle was stark, but Joseph adapted with the flexibility that had characterized his entire spiritual practice. When Sarah first saw Joseph in person, the recognition was immediate and overwhelming. The elderly man walking slowly through the hospital corridor was exactly the spiritual presence who had sustained her through 6 days of impossible conditions. But seeing him in physical form also revealed the cost of his efforts. He appeared frailer than in her visions, his movements careful and deliberate. "You look smaller than in the spirit world," Sarah said, when they were finally alone in the research laboratory, surrounded by monitoring equipment that would record their interaction. Joseph smiled, his weathered face creasing with genuine humor. "Physical bodies have limitations that spirits do not, but you look exactly as I saw you in my dreams, strong, determined, marked by survival." Dr. Foster watched the brain monitoring displays with growing amazement as Sarah and Joseph talked. Both participants showed synchronized neural activity in regions associated with empathy and intuition, patterns that suggested an ongoing connection between their consciousness that persisted even in normal waking states. More remarkably, Sarah's spatial awareness capabilities appeared to be enhanced when Joseph was present. Tests conducted with him in the room showed her ability to accurately locate hidden objects, predict random number sequences, and even sense the emotional states of people in adjacent rooms. When Joseph left the testing area, these abilities diminished significantly, but didn't disappear entirely. This suggests that your spiritual connection created permanent changes in both of your neurological functioning, Dr. Foster explained. To the research team reviewing the data, it's as if they've developed a form of quantum entanglement at the consciousness level. The scientific implications were staggering, but Joseph and Sarah were more interested in understanding the purpose behind their extraordinary experience. During their private conversations, they explored the meaning of what had happened to them and what responsibilities it might entail. In Navajo tradition, those who survive impossible trials are expected to use their experience to help others, Joseph explained as they walked through the hospital's healing garden. "Your survival was not random. It was preparation for work that only you can do." Sarah had been struggling with this concept since her rescue. The media attention surrounding her survival had been intense, with reporters and documentary filmmakers clamoring for interviews about her miraculous rescue. But she instinctively understood that reducing their experience to sensational entertainment would diminish its true significance. "What kind of work?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Joseph's response confirmed her intuition. "There are others who will face impossible situations, people who need to understand that survival sometimes requires accepting help from sources they don't understand. You can teach them to recognize spiritual guidance when it comes, to trust in connections that transcend physical limitations." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen, who approached them with news that would reshape both of their futures. "Sarah, we've received a request from the International Mountain Rescue Association. They want you to speak at their annual conference about survival psychology and unconventional rescue methods." The invitation represented Sarah's first opportunity to share her story with people who might actually be able to use the information practically. Mountain rescue professionals dealt with impossible situations regularly and might be more open to expanding their understanding of human survival capabilities. But accepting the speaking engagement would also require Sarah to publicly discuss spiritual elements that most audiences would find difficult to believe. She would have to find ways to communicate the reality of her experience without sounding delusional or undermining her credibility as a survival expert. Joseph offered to accompany her to the conference, providing traditional Navajo perspectives on spiritual rescue that could contextualize Sarah's experience within established indigenous knowledge systems. The partnership would demonstrate that her survival wasn't an isolated anomaly, but part of a larger tradition of spiritual intervention. In crisis situations, as their collaboration developed, Sarah and Joseph discovered that their connection continued to evolve. They could communicate across distances without technology, sharing insights and intuitions that proved remarkably accurate. More importantly, they began to sense other people in crisis situations, individuals whose survival might benefit from the unconventional guidance they could provide. Their first intervention came just 2 months after Sarah's rescue. A teenage hiker named Marcus Thompson had become lost in the Grand Canyon during a flash flood, trapped in a narrow canyon with rising water and no obvious escape route. Traditional search methods had failed to locate him, and conditions were too dangerous for ground teams to continue searching. Joseph experienced dreams about Marcus's location with the same clarity that had guided Sarah's rescue. Working through Dr. Chen and the expanding network of rescue professionals who had heard Sarah's story, they provided coordinates that led helicopters directly to the teenager's position. Marcus's rescue validated the potential for their unconventional methods, but it also attracted attention from skeptics who demanded scientific explanations for phenomena that operated outside established paradigms. Sarah found herself navigating between the worlds of empirical research and spiritual tradition, trying to bridge gaps between knowledge systems that had historically been considered incompatible. Dr. Foster's research provided some support for their claims, documenting measurable changes in brain function that correlated with their reported abilities. But the scientific community remained divided, with some researchers embracing the implications, while others dismissed the findings as measurement errors or psychological delusions. The controversy didn't deter Sarah and Joseph from continuing their work. Over the following months, they assisted with 3 more rescue operations, each time providing location intelligence that proved accurate and essential for successful outcomes. Their track record gradually earned acceptance from pragmatic rescue professionals who cared more about results than explanations. But the most significant development came when Sarah began experiencing her own prophetic dreams, visions that appeared independently of Joseph's guidance. The spiritual awakening that had begun during her burial under the Avalanche was continuing to unfold, granting her access to forms of awareness that she was still learning to understand and control. One particularly vivid dream showed her standing before a large audience, speaking about survival and resilience to people who desperately needed hope. The vision was so clear and compelling that Sarah began preparing for a future she couldn't yet fully comprehend, but felt called to embrace. Joseph recognized the signs of spiritual awakening in Sarah's expanding abilities. "You are becoming a bridge between worlds," he told her during one of their regular meetings. "Your experience has opened pathways that will allow others to access guidance they never knew existed." As the first anniversary of her rescue approached, Sarah reflected on the profound changes that had transformed her life. She had survived an impossible situation, formed a spiritual connection that transcended normal understanding, and discovered abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that survival wasn't just about individual strength and skill. It was about recognizing the interconnected nature of all existence, about accepting help from unexpected sources, and about using extraordinary experiences to serve purposes larger than personal preservation. The mountain had tested her beyond her limits and found her worthy not just of survival, but of a mission that would spend the rest of her life fulfilling. Together with Joseph Begay, she was pioneering new approaches to rescue and survival that honored both scientific rigor and spiritual wisdom, proving that some of life's most important truths emerged at the intersection of worlds that most people never learned to see. 1 year after her rescue, Sarah Mitchell stood before an audience of 300 mountain rescue professionals at the International Conference on Wilderness Emergency Medicine in Denver, Colorado. The auditorium buzzed with skeptical energy as she prepared to present findings that would challenge everything these experienced rescuers thought they knew about locating survivors in impossible conditions. Beside her on the stage sat Joseph Begay, his presence lending traditional authority to claims that might otherwise be dismissed as New Age fantasy. Dr. Foster had flown in from Seattle with neurological data that provided scientific context for their extraordinary abilities, while Commander Park represented the military perspective on unconventional rescue methods. 18 months ago, I would have been sitting in your seats rolling my eyes at anyone claiming to find lost hikers through spiritual visions, Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived the impossible. Today, I'm here to present documented evidence of 7 successful rescue operations that were completed using methods your training never covered. The audience stirred with interest despite their skepticism. Mountain rescue was a profession built on pragmatic results, and 7 successful operations represented a success rate that demanded attention regardless of the methods involved. Dr. Foster took the podium next, presenting brain imaging data that showed measurable changes in consciousness during what she termed enhanced spatial awareness episodes. The scientific language provided comfortable frameworks for phenomena that challenged conventional understanding, but the implications were revolutionary. We're documenting neural activity patterns that suggest human consciousness can access information beyond normal sensory channels, Dr. Foster explained, displaying colorful brain scans that showed unusual synchronization between different cognitive regions. While we don't yet understand the mechanisms involved, the practical applications for search and rescue operations are undeniable. Joseph's presentation was the most challenging for the audience to process, speaking in measured tones that conveyed deep respect for traditional knowledge. He explained Navajo concepts of spiritual guidance that had been developed over centuries of desert survival. My people have always understood that the land itself can provide information to those who know how to listen, Joseph said. What you call impossible, we call the normal way of finding the lost. Sarah's survival opened her to these older ways of knowing. The conference marked a turning point in how the rescue community viewed unconventional methods. While many attendees remained skeptical, enough were intrigued by the documented success rate to request additional information about incorporating spiritual guidance into standard rescue protocols. But the most significant development occurred during the conference's final day, when Sarah experienced her most powerful vision yet. While participating in a panel discussion about extreme survival psychology, she suddenly became aware of an ongoing emergency situation that was unfolding in real time. "There's a climbing accident happening right now," Sarah announced, interrupting the panel moderator mid-sentence. 2 climbers are trapped on a technical route in Rocky Mountain National Park. One has severe internal injuries, and conventional rescue methods won't reach them before hypothermia sets in. The specificity of her vision shocked everyone present. Sarah provided exact coordinates, detailed descriptions of the terrain, and even information about the climber's equipment and experience levels. Most remarkably, she described weather conditions that would affect rescue operations over the next 6 hours. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had participated in Sarah's original rescue and was now attending the conference, immediately contacted the Rocky Mountain National Park Rescue Coordination Center. Within minutes, park rangers confirmed that 2 climbers had indeed failed to return from a technical route, and search helicopters were being deployed to investigate. Sarah's vision proved accurate in every detail. The climbers were located exactly where she had predicted, in precisely the condition she had described. More importantly, her advance warning about approaching weather conditions allowed rescue teams to adjust their strategy and complete the extraction before storm systems made helicopter operations impossible. The real-time demonstration of Sarah's abilities transformed the conference atmosphere from skeptical curiosity to serious professional interest. Rescue coordinators began asking practical questions about how such information could be integrated into emergency response systems. Commander Park, whose military background made her naturally cautious about unproven methods, found herself reconsidering fundamental assumptions about information gathering in crisis situations. If we can document and verify these abilities, we need to develop protocols for incorporating them into rescue operations, she told the conference organizers. The discussion led to the formation of the Enhanced Rescue Intelligence Project, a collaborative effort between traditional rescue organizations and researchers studying consciousness-based information gathering. Sarah and Joseph were invited to serve as primary consultants, helping to develop training programs that might awaken similar abilities in other rescue professionals. But their expanding role in the rescue community also attracted unwanted attention from skeptics and debunkers who were determined to expose what they considered elaborate fraud. Dr. Harrison Webb, a prominent psychologist who specializes in debunking paranormal claims, launched a public campaign to discredit Sarah's abilities and the research supporting them. We're seeing classic cases of confirmation bias and selective reporting, Webb declared during a televised debate with Dr. Foster. These so-called psychic rescues can be explained by lucky guesses, insider information, and the natural human tendency to see patterns where none exist. The controversy forced Sarah to document her abilities under increasingly rigorous scientific conditions. She submitted to controlled testing at multiple research institutions, demonstrating her capacity to locate hidden objects, predict weather patterns, and even sense the emotional states of people in distant locations. The most compelling evidence came from a series of blind tests conducted by Dr. Michael Chang at Stanford University's Consciousness Research Laboratory. Sarah was asked to locate volunteer subjects who had been randomly positioned throughout the San Francisco Bay Area, providing only their names and the general region where they might be found. Over 15 trials, Sarah successfully located 12 subjects within a margin of error that would have been impossible through random chance. More remarkably, she provided accurate descriptions of the subjects' immediate environments, including details about buildings, landscape features, and even weather conditions at their specific locations. Dr. Chang's published findings sparked intense debate within the scientific community, but they also provided the credibility that Sarah needed to expand her rescue work. Government agencies began consulting with her on missing person cases, while international rescue organizations requested her assistance with disasters in remote locations. The most challenging case came when a commercial airliner disappeared over the Amazon rainforest, carrying 43 passengers and crew members. Traditional search methods had failed to locate the aircraft after 2 weeks of intensive searching across thousands of square miles of dense jungle. Sarah's vision of the crash site was extraordinarily detailed, showing the aircraft's final resting place in a narrow valley surrounded by nearly impenetrable forest canopy. But reaching the location would require a rescue operation unlike anything previously attempted, combining advanced helicopter techniques with indigenous knowledge of Amazon navigation. Joseph provided spiritual guidance for the operation, working with local shamans who understood the jungle's spiritual geography. Their combined efforts created what Dr. Chang later described as the most documented case of collaborative consciousness-based rescue in modern history. The aircraft was located exactly where Sarah had predicted, though the condition of the survivors presented new challenges that tested the limits of both conventional and unconventional rescue methods. 18 passengers had survived the initial crash, but after 3 weeks in the Amazon, they were suffering from various tropical diseases, severe dehydration, and psychological trauma. Sarah's abilities proved crucial during the extraction phase, as she could sense which survivors were in the most critical condition and needed priority medical attention. Her guidance helped medical teams allocate limited resources efficiently, ultimately saving lives that might have been lost to triage decisions based solely on visible symptoms. The Amazon rescue operation established Sarah and Joseph as internationally recognized experts in impossible rescue situations, but success also brought pressures that tested their partnership and their individual capacity to handle the demands of their expanding mission. Sarah began experiencing what she called vision overload, an overwhelming flow of information about crisis situations worldwide that threatened to consume her normal consciousness. The constant awareness of human suffering in distant locations created psychological stress that conventional therapy couldn't address. Joseph, now 75 and showing his age, struggled with the physical demands of maintaining spiritual guidance across multiple time zones and cultural contexts. The spiritual energy required for international rescue work was exponentially greater than the local operations they had initially undertaken. Dr. White Eagle, the Navajo physician who had been monitoring Joseph's health, expressed concerns about the sustainability of their current pace. "The human body and spirit have limits," he warned during a private consultation. "Even the most powerful medicine people need time to restore their energy between major spiritual efforts." The warning proved prophetic when Joseph collapsed during a rescue operation involving trapped miners in Chile. He had been providing spiritual guidance for nearly 18 hours straight when his consciousness simply couldn't maintain the connection across such vast distances for such extended periods. Sarah felt Joseph's collapse as a physical shock that temporarily severed her own enhanced abilities. For the first time since her Avalanche survival, she found herself unable to access the spiritual information that had become central to her identity and her life's work. The experience forced both of them to confront the limitations of their extraordinary gifts and to consider more sustainable approaches to their rescue mission. They began working with Dr. Foster and other researchers to develop techniques for sharing the spiritual workload among multiple practitioners, creating networks of consciousness that could maintain guidance without overwhelming individual participants. The solution emerged through collaboration with indigenous elders from various traditions who had maintained similar abilities within their own cultural contexts. A Tibetan monk named Tenzin Norbu, an Aboriginal Australian named William Namatjira, and a Sami reindeer herder named Nilas Sombi all possessed forms of enhanced spatial awareness that complemented Sarah and Joseph's capabilities. Together, they formed what became known as the Global Rescue Consciousness Network, a group of individuals who could provide spiritual guidance for emergency situations anywhere in the world. The network's first major test came during a massive earthquake in Nepal, where conventional rescue efforts were hampered by destroyed infrastructure and challenging terrain. Working in coordinated shifts, the network members provided continuous, spiritual guidance that helped rescue teams locate survivors trapped beneath collapsed buildings throughout the Kathmandu Valley. Their success rate exceeded anything achieved through conventional search methods, validating the potential for consciousness-based rescue techniques on a global scale. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of new practitioners, who seemed to develop enhanced abilities after working closely with the network members. Dr. Foster documented cases of rescue workers who began experiencing their own visions and intuitive insights, suggesting that the spiritual awakening Sarah had experienced might be contagious or teachable. Sarah found herself evolving from rescue practitioner to teacher, helping others recognize and develop their own forms of consciousness-based awareness. The work was profoundly fulfilling, but it also revealed the true scope of human potential that most people never imagined they possessed. As she reflected on the 3 years that had passed since her avalanche survival, Sarah understood that her rescue had been only the beginning of a much larger story. The mountain had tested her and found her worthy not just of survival, but of a mission that was still unfolding in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. The ripple effects of her impossible rescue continued to expand, touching lives and transforming rescue operations around the world. But the most important transformation was the growing recognition that human consciousness possessed capabilities that science was only beginning to understand, and that survival itself might be more mysterious and more miraculous than anyone had previously dared to imagine. 5 years after her avalanche survival, Sarah Mitchell discovered that her extraordinary abilities were evolving in directions that even Joseph Begay hadn't anticipated. What had begun as enhanced spatial awareness for rescue operations was transforming into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The first indication came during a routine training session at the Enhanced Rescue Intelligence Project's new facility in Colorado Springs. Sarah was working with a group of emergency responders, helping them develop their own intuitive awareness, when she suddenly began experiencing visions that had nothing to do with current rescue operations. Instead, she saw events from the past. The original avalanche that had buried her, but from perspectives she had never experienced. She witnessed the moment of the slope failure from above, as if viewing it through the eyes of circling eagles. She observed the avalanche debris settling around her unconscious body from within the moving snow itself. Most disturbing, she experienced the moment of her rescue from the viewpoint of the mountain itself, as if the landscape possessed its own form of consciousness. Dr. Foster, who was monitoring the training session, noticed immediately that Sarah's brain activity had shifted into patterns they had never recorded before. "Sarah, can you describe what you're experiencing?" she asked, her voice tight with professional concern. Sarah's response came in a voice that sounded different, older somehow, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from sources beyond her physical body. "The mountain remembers everything," she said. "Every avalanche, every life lost, every rescue. The stone holds memories that stretch back thousands of years." The episode lasted only minutes, but its implications troubled everyone present. Sarah's abilities had always focused on present moment awareness and future predictions. This glimpse into deep time suggested that her consciousness was accessing information stored in the landscape itself, tapping into what some traditions called the memory of the earth. Joseph, now 77 and serving as the project's senior spiritual advisor, recognized the signs of what Navajo tradition termed walking with the ancestors of the land. It was a rare and potentially overwhelming gift that required careful guidance to prevent the practitioner from becoming lost in the vast streams of geological time. She is becoming something that our people have stories about, but rarely witness. Joseph explained to Dr. Foster during a private consultation, there are those who can speak with the consciousness of the earth itself, but the knowledge comes with great responsibility and great risk. The risk became apparent during Sarah's next major rescue operation. A research station in Antarctica had lost contact with the outside world during a severe storm, and conventional rescue attempts were impossible due to weather conditions that wouldn't clear for weeks. The 12 scientists and support personnel at the station faced certain death unless emergency supplies could be delivered within days. Sarah's vision of the Antarctic situation was unlike anything she had experienced before. Instead of simply sensing the location and condition of the trapped personnel, she found herself experiencing Antarctica itself as a living entity, ancient, patient, and utterly indifferent to human survival. The ice sheets spoke to her in voices that predated human language, sharing knowledge of weather patterns that wouldn't appear on any meteorological forecast. The continent's consciousness revealed hidden safe zones where aircraft could land despite storm conditions, but it also communicated something far more unsettling. Antarctica knows that climate change will reshape its entire existence within decades, Sarah reported to the rescue coordination team. The ice consciousness is preparing for transformation. Our rescue operation is insignificant compared to the geological changes it's anticipating. The information proved crucial for the rescue mission. Sarah's guidance allowed supply aircraft to navigate through seemingly impossible weather conditions, delivering emergency provisions that sustained the research team until conventional evacuation became possible. But the experience left Sarah profoundly shaken by her encounter with forms of consciousness that operated on geological rather than human timescales. Dr. Chang, who had been documenting Sarah's abilities for years, recognized that her consciousness was accessing information at unprecedented scales. We're seeing neural activity that suggests Sarah is somehow interfacing with environmental data storage systems we didn't know existed, he explained to the international team of researchers studying her case. The implications extended far beyond rescue operations. If human consciousness could access information stored in landscapes, ecosystems, and geological formations, it suggested that the Earth itself possessed forms of memory and awareness that science was only beginning to recognize. But Sarah's expanding abilities also attracted attention from organizations with interests far removed from humanitarian rescue work. Government intelligence agencies began inquiring about potential applications for consciousness-based information gathering in national security contexts. Military research divisions wanted to explore whether Sarah's techniques could be adapted for locating enemy installations or predicting conflict patterns. The pressure to weaponize her abilities created ethical dilemmas that Sarah hadn't anticipated when she first began her rescue work. During a tense meeting with Pentagon officials, she was asked to demonstrate her capabilities by locating specific military targets in classified scenarios. "My abilities are for saving lives, not taking them," Sarah firmly declared, surprising the officials with the absoluteness of her position. "The consciousness I access operates according to principles of healing and restoration. Attempting to use it for destructive purposes would sever my connection permanently." The statement wasn't just moral posturing. Sarah had discovered through experience that her enhanced abilities were directly tied to her intentions and emotional state. Attempts to use her visions for selfish purposes or harmful objectives consistently resulted in blocked access to the spiritual information sources she relied upon. Joseph confirmed her understanding from traditional perspectives. The spirits that guide rescue work serve the sacred principle of preserving life, he explained. They will not assist in activities that contradict this purpose. Sarah's connection depends on maintaining harmony with these spiritual forces. The ethical boundaries became even more complex when Sarah began receiving visions about future disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and severe weather events that could kill thousands of people if no preventive action was taken. The question of whether to share such information and with whom created moral dilemmas that had no clear precedents. Her first major precognitive vision involved a catastrophic landslide that would destroy a village in the Philippines within 6 months. Sarah could see the specific triggering conditions: heavy rains combined with deforestation that had destabilized the hillside above the community. She even witnessed the moment of the slide's initiation and its devastating path through the village. The vision was so detailed and emotionally overwhelming that Sarah spent days debating whether to share the information. Warning the authorities might save hundreds of lives, but it would also expose her abilities to international scrutiny that could compromise her rescue work. More troubling, she wasn't certain whether attempting to prevent predicted disasters might disrupt natural cycles in ways that could cause even greater catastrophes elsewhere. Joseph helped her work through the ethical complexity using traditional decision-making processes that considered consequences across multiple generations. The spirits show you these visions for a purpose, he counseled. But the responsibility is yours to determine how to honor the knowledge while maintaining balance. Sarah ultimately decided to share the landslide prediction with Dr. Chen, who had developed contacts within international disaster relief organizations. The information was presented as geological analysis rather than psychic prediction, focusing on observable risk factors that could be verified through conventional surveying methods. The warning proved accurate. Philippine geological survey teams confirmed the instability Sarah had perceived, and the village was evacuated just 3 weeks before the landslide occurred, exactly as she had foreseen. The successful intervention saved 347 lives, but it also established a pattern that would define Sarah's work for years to come. Her role evolved from reactive rescue operations to proactive disaster prevention, but the psychological burden of constantly witnessing future catastrophes began taking a severe toll. Sarah found herself experiencing what she called temporal displacement, difficulty maintaining awareness of present-moment reality while simultaneously processing information from multiple time streams. The condition was unprecedented in psychological literature, requiring Dr. Foster to develop entirely new therapeutic approaches. Traditional counseling methods were inadequate for someone whose consciousness routinely operated across multiple temporal and spatial dimensions. The solution came through collaboration with Tibetan meditation masters who had developed techniques for managing expanded consciousness states. Tenzin Norbu, the monk who had joined the Global Rescue Consciousness Network, taught Sarah ancient practices for maintaining spiritual equilibrium while accessing cosmic-scale information. The mind that touches universal consciousness must learn to return to the simplicity of breathing, Tenzin explained during Sarah's intensive meditation training in the Colorado mountains. Wisdom without grounding becomes madness. Your gift requires the foundation of ordinary human awareness. The training helped Sarah develop what she called conscious scaling, the ability to deliberately adjust the scope and intensity of her awareness depending on the situation at hand. She learned to access geological consciousness for major disaster predictions while maintaining normal human perspective for daily life and personal relationships. But perhaps the most significant development was Sarah's growing understanding that her abilities were not unique aberrations, but examples of human potential that most people possessed in dormant form. Her work with the training programs revealed that many individuals could develop enhanced awareness given proper instruction and practice. The discovery suggested that consciousness itself might be far more flexible and powerful than conventional psychology recognized. Rather than being isolated cases of paranormal ability, Sarah and the other network members might represent early examples of human evolution toward expanded awareness capabilities. Dr. Foster's research supported this hypothesis, documenting measurable increases in intuitive abilities among rescue workers who had undergone training with the network members. Brain imaging showed that intensive practice could literally rewire neural pathways, creating new connections that supported enhanced spatial awareness and temporal perception. The implications were revolutionary. If expanded consciousness could be taught and developed systematically, it might represent humanity's next evolutionary step, a transition from purely physical and technological problem-solving toward direct awareness-based interaction with environmental and temporal information systems. But evolution also brought new challenges. As more people developed enhanced abilities, the network faced questions about how to maintain ethical standards and prevent misuse of consciousness-based information gathering. Not everyone who gained these abilities would necessarily use them for humanitarian purposes. Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of helping establish protocols for what amounted to psychic regulation, determining who should have access to consciousness expansion training and how to monitor the use of enhanced abilities. For destructive purposes, the responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also the logical extension of her journey from Avalanche survivor to global rescue coordinator to pioneer of human consciousness development. Each stage had prepared her for greater challenges and broader responsibilities. As she reflected on the 7 years since her rescue, Sarah understood that the mountain had tested her not just for survival, but for leadership in humanity's expanding awareness of its own potential. The Avalanche had been the beginning of a transformation that was still unfolding, both within her own consciousness and within the broader human community that was slowly awakening to possibilities that had always existed but rarely been recognized. The deeper mysteries of consciousness were revealed through her work, showing that the boundaries between human awareness and cosmic intelligence were far more permeable than anyone had imagined. But with that revelation came the responsibility to guide others safely through the same transformational process that had begun when she first heard Joseph Begay's voice calling to her through impossible distances beneath tons of crushing snow. 8 years after her Avalanche survival, Sarah Mitchell discovered that her consciousness-based rescue work had attracted adversaries whose existence she had never suspected. The revelation came during what should have been a routine consultation about a missing cargo ship in the North Atlantic, when her enhanced awareness suddenly encountered something that felt fundamentally wrong, a deliberate attempt to block her spiritual vision. The interference was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. Instead of the natural limitations that sometimes constrained her abilities, this felt like active opposition from human consciousness trained specifically to counter psychic awareness. Someone with knowledge of her methods was systematically working to prevent her from accessing the information needed to locate the missing vessel. "There's something blocking me," Sarah reported to Captain Elena Rodriguez of the International Maritime Rescue Coordination Center during their emergency video conference. "It's not natural interference. Someone is deliberately scrambling the spiritual frequencies I need to track the ship." Captain Rodriguez, who had worked with Sarah on 6 previous maritime rescue operations, immediately understood the implications. If hostile forces were actively countering consciousness-based rescue methods, It suggested the existence of organizations with both advanced understanding of psychic phenomena and reasons to prevent successful rescue operations. The missing cargo. Ship, the Atlantic Meridian, carried more than just commercial goods. Intelligence reports suggested it was transporting sensitive technology that several governments wanted to acquire or prevent from reaching its destination. The ship's disappearance might not have been accidental, and the psychic interference confirmed that powerful interests were involved. Joseph Begay, now approaching 80, but still serving as the network's senior spiritual advisor, recognized the interference pattern from traditional Navajo accounts of spiritual warfare. There are those who learn the sacred ways not to heal, but to harm, he explained during an emergency meeting of the Global Rescue Consciousness Network. They use the same techniques we employ for guidance, but they twist them toward deception and control. The existence of what Joseph called shadow walkers, practitioners who used consciousness-based abilities for destructive purposes, forced the network to confront possibilities they had never considered. If their methods could be learned and corrupted, they needed defenses against hostile psychic interference. Dr. Foster's research team immediately began studying the phenomenon, using brain imaging technology to analyze the neurological effects of the interference Sarah was experiencing. The results were deeply disturbing. The hostile consciousness was creating what appeared to be cognitive dissonance fields, areas of mental static that prevented Sarah's awareness from achieving the clarity needed for accurate location work. We're seeing interference patterns that suggest sophisticated understanding of consciousness manipulation, Dr. Foster reported to the network's emergency council. Whoever is doing this has studied our methods extensively and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize consciousness-based information gathering. The implications extended far beyond the missing cargo ship. If hostile organizations could block psychic rescue operations, they could potentially trap victims in disaster situations while preventing anyone from locating them. The thought of people dying because their rescuers had been psychically blinded was horrifying to everyone involved in the network's humanitarian mission. Tenzin Norbu, the Tibetan monk whose meditation expertise had helped Sarah develop her consciousness. Scaling techniques offered insights from Buddhist traditions dealing with spiritual opposition. In Tibet, we learned long ago that expanded awareness attracts both light and shadow, he explained. Those who develop psychic abilities for selfish purposes often seek to corrupt or destroy those who use them for service. The immediate challenge was finding the Atlantic Meridian, despite the psychic interference. Sarah worked with Tenzin and Joseph to develop what they called spiritual stealth, techniques for accessing information while remaining undetectable to hostile consciousness monitoring. The method required Sarah to fragment her awareness into multiple smaller streams of consciousness, each too subtle to trigger the interference mechanisms, but collectively capable of gathering the information needed for rescue operations. It was extraordinarily demanding, requiring precise mental discipline to maintain multiple awareness threads while preventing them from becoming detectable to the shadow practitioners. After 18 hours of intensive spiritual work, Sarah finally penetrated the interference field and located the Atlantic Meridian. The cargo ship had been deliberately disabled and was drifting in international waters, its crew held hostage by a private military organization that intended to steal the sensitive technology in the ship's cargo hold, but the discovery created new ethical dilemmas. The network's mission was humanitarian rescue, not law enforcement or military intervention. Sharing the ship's location with authorities would likely result in armed conflict that could endanger the crew members they were trying to save. Sarah's enhanced awareness revealed additional complications. The private military organization holding the ship had their own consciousness-based operators, mercenary psychics who were using their abilities to monitor rescue communications and counter any attempts to locate their position. "We're dealing with the commercialization of spiritual abilities," Dr. Chang observed during the crisis coordination meeting. "Someone has figured out how to profit from consciousness-based operations by selling psychic services to the highest bidder, regardless of the ethical implications." The revelation that enhanced consciousness abilities were being weaponized and sold to criminal organizations represented a nightmare scenario that none of the network founders had anticipated. Their work to expand human awareness had inadvertently created a black market for psychic mercenaries. Joseph's reaction was profound and deeply personal. "We have failed in our responsibility as teachers," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of cultural violations that went beyond individual wrongdoing. "In sharing the sacred ways, we did not ensure that those who learned them would honor the principles that make them possible." The crisis forced the network to develop rapid response protocols for dealing with hostile psychic interference. Working with military advisors who understood asymmetric warfare, they created techniques for psychic combat that maintained their humanitarian principles while protecting their ability to conduct rescue operations. Sarah found herself learning abilities she had never wanted to develop, methods for disrupting hostile consciousness operations, creating protective barriers around her awareness, and even launching what amounted to psychic counterattacks against those who were blocking rescue efforts. The spiritual combat was unlike any form of conflict she had previously experienced. Instead of physical violence, the battles took place in dimensions of consciousness, where intention and willpower were the primary weapons. Sarah discovered she could neutralize hostile interference by overwhelming it with focused compassion, a technique that confused mercenary psychics who had trained only for aggressive confrontation. Love is the strongest force in the spiritual realm, Joseph explained as he taught Sarah advanced defensive techniques. Those who use consciousness for harm cannot maintain their abilities when confronted with genuine spiritual love. But you must be careful not to let anger or hatred contaminate your own intentions. The rescue of the Atlantic Meridian became a complex operation involving both consciousness-based intelligence gathering and coordinated international law enforcement. Sarah's spiritual guidance allowed authorities to approach the hijacked vessel without triggering the mercenary psychic's early warning systems, while her protective techniques prevented hostile interference from compromising the rescue team's communications. The operation succeeded in freeing the crew and recovering the stolen technology, but it also revealed the scope of the shadow network that was corrupting consciousness-based abilities. Intelligence agencies briefed the rescue network on dozens of similar organizations operating worldwide, selling psychic services to criminal enterprises, hostile governments, and terrorist organizations. "We're looking at the emergence of an entirely new form of warfare," explained Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Defense Intelligence Agency during a classified briefing with network leadership. "Consciousness-based operations are becoming a standard component of asymmetric conflict. We need your help to understand how to defend against these capabilities." The request put the network in an impossible position. Cooperating with military intelligence would compromise their humanitarian mission and potentially expose their methods to the same weaponization they were trying to prevent. But refusing to help develop defenses against hostile psychic operations could allow the shadow networks to expand unchecked. Sarah proposed a middle path that would preserve the network's humanitarian focus while addressing the security threats posed by corrupted consciousness abilities. They would develop defensive techniques and share them with legitimate rescue and law enforcement organizations, but they would not participate in offensive psychic operations or help create weapons based on consciousness manipulation. The decision led to the establishment of the Consciousness Defense Initiative, a joint program between the Rescue Network and international security agencies focused specifically on protecting humanitarian operations from psychic interference. The program would train emergency responders in basic psychic defense, while developing technologies that could detect and counter consciousness-based attacks. But the most significant development was Sarah's growing understanding that the conflict between humanitarian and corrupted consciousness abilities represented a fundamental choice point for human evolution. The same expanded awareness that enabled miraculous rescues could also be used for manipulation, control, and destruction. "We're at a crossroads," Sarah explained during a global video conference with consciousness researchers worldwide. "The abilities we've developed can either help humanity evolve toward greater compassion and connection, or they can become tools for unprecedented forms of exploitation and control. The choice we make now will determine which path our species follows." The responsibility was overwhelming, but Sarah had been prepared for it by 8 years of increasingly complex challenges. Her journey from Avalanche survivor to global rescue coordinator to consciousness evolution pioneer had been building toward this moment of choice between light and shadow applications of human potential. Dr. Foster's latest research revealed that the neural pathways associated with consciousness expansion could develop in fundamentally different directions depending on the intentions and emotional states of the practitioner. Compassion-based training created brain changes that supported empathy and connection, while manipulation-focused development led to neural patterns associated with narcissism and exploitation. We're seeing that consciousness itself can evolve in multiple directions, Dr. Foster reported to the international scientific community. The same basic human potential can manifest as either enhanced love and service or enhanced selfishness and control. The choice appears to be made at the level of individual motivation and training methods. The discovery confirmed what Joseph had always taught from traditional perspectives, that spiritual abilities were not morally neutral tools, but expressions of the practitioner's deepest values and intentions. Those who sought consciousness expansion for selfish purposes would inevitably develop corrupted abilities, while those motivated by service would access higher forms of awareness. As the shadow network crisis unfolded, Sarah realized that her true mission was not just conducting rescues or teaching consciousness expansion, but helping humanity navigate the ethical challenges of its own evolving abilities. The mountain that had tested her 8 years earlier had been preparing her not just for survival, but for leadership during the most critical period in human consciousness development. The avalanche had buried her in snow, but it had also buried her old identity and limitations. What had emerged was someone capable of guiding others through the treacherous territory between human potential and human corruption, helping the species choose evolution toward connection rather than manipulation. But the shadow networks were growing stronger and more sophisticated, and Sarah understood that the conflict between light and dark applications of consciousness was only beginning. The next phase of her mission would require all the wisdom and strength she had developed, as she worked to ensure that humanity's expanding awareness served love rather than power. 10 years after her avalanche survival, Sarah Mitchell discovered that consciousness expansion was manifesting in an entirely unexpected population. Children born to parents who had undergone awareness training were displaying psychic abilities from birth. The phenomenon first came to light when Maria Begay contacted Sarah about her 6-year-old daughter, Eleanor, who had begun experiencing detailed visions about distant locations and future events. "She woke up this morning describing a house fire that happened in Denver last night," Maria explained during their emergency video call. She knew details that hadn't been reported on any news coverage, the exact address, the family's names, even which room the fire started in. But what's really concerning is that she says the light people are teaching her things in her dreams. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. During her intensive consciousness training with the network, she had occasionally glimpsed what she called light beings, entities that existed in pure consciousness without physical form. These beings had seemed benevolent, offering guidance about consciousness expansion, but their interest in a 6-year-old child raised questions that no one was prepared to answer. Dr. Foster's research team had been tracking unusual birth patterns among network members' families for several years, but Elena Begay represented the most dramatic case yet documented. Brain imaging revealed neural development that was unprecedented in pediatric neurology. Areas associated with spatial awareness and temporal perception were already showing activity levels typically seen only in advanced meditation masters. We're looking at what appears to be evolutionary acceleration, Dr. Foster explained during an emergency meeting of the network's scientific advisory board. These children aren't learning consciousness expansion techniques. They're being born with capabilities that took adults years to develop through intensive training. The implications were staggering. If consciousness evolution was becoming hereditary, it suggested that humanity was undergoing a species-wide transformation triggered by the network's awareness expansion work. But it also meant that children were accessing levels of psychic ability without the ethical training and psychological preparation that had been essential for adult practitioners. Joseph Begay, now 81 and deeply concerned about his great-granddaughter's precocious abilities, consulted traditional Navajo sources about similar phenomena in the past. What he discovered in the oldest stories suggested that such accelerated consciousness development had occurred before, during previous periods of major planetary transition. The elders speak of times when the children are born already walking between worlds, Joseph told Sarah during a private consultation in Monument Valley. These are periods when the Earth itself is changing and human consciousness must evolve rapidly to survive the transformation. The children come as teachers for the adults who have forgotten how to navigate the new realities. But Elena Begay was not an isolated case. Within months, reports began arriving from around the world of children displaying similar abilities. A 7-year-old boy in Norway was providing accurate weather predictions weeks in advance. Twin girls in Australia could locate lost objects anywhere in their city through pure intuition. A 9-year-old in Kenya was healing sick animals by laying hands on them and somehow transferring life energy. More disturbing were reports that these children were also attracting attention from the shadow networks that had been corrupting consciousness abilities for criminal purposes. Intelligence agencies briefed Sarah on attempted kidnappings and recruitment efforts targeting psychically gifted children, suggesting that the same organizations that had opposed humanitarian rescue work now saw child psychics as valuable assets. We're dealing with the potential exploitation of a generation of children who possess abilities that most adults can barely comprehend, warned Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Paranormal Crimes Division, a unit that had been created specifically to address consciousness-related criminal activity. These kids need protection, but conventional child welfare systems aren't equipped to handle psychic phenomena. Sarah found herself thrust into a role she had never anticipated: protector and educator for children whose abilities exceeded her own in some areas while lacking the wisdom and ethical grounding necessary to use them safely. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also the logical extension of her journey from Avalanche survivor to consciousness pioneer. Working with Dr. Foster and a team of child psychologists, Sarah developed the first educational protocols for psychically gifted children. The programs had to balance consciousness expansion training with normal childhood development, ensuring that extraordinary abilities didn't prevent the children from forming healthy relationships and maintaining connections to ordinary reality. The educational challenge was unprecedented. Traditional schooling was inadequate for children who could sense their teachers' thoughts and emotions, predict test questions through precognitive flashes, or become overwhelmed by psychic impressions from their classmates. These children needed specialized environments that acknowledged their abilities while teaching them how to control and direct their consciousness expansion. Elena Begay became the first student in what would eventually become the Aurora Institute, a residential school for psychically gifted children located in the mountains of Colorado. The school's mission was to provide education that honored both extraordinary abilities and normal human development, creating graduates who could serve as bridges between expanded consciousness and conventional society. But the children themselves had ideas about their purpose that surprised even their most experienced teachers. During group meditation sessions, they consistently reported contact with the same light beings that Elena had mentioned, entities that seemed to be providing advanced instruction in consciousness techniques that went far beyond anything the adult network had discovered. "The light people say we're here to help the Earth get ready for big changes," Elena explained during one of her sessions with Sarah. "They show us how to talk to the weather, how to help animals when they're scared, and how to find people who are lost not just in space but in time." The reference to being lost in time proved to be more than childish imagination. The psychic children were demonstrating abilities to interact with past and future events in ways that challenged basic assumptions about temporal causality. They could apparently communicate with people who had died decades earlier and receive information from potential futures that hadn't yet manifested. Dr. Chang's research team documented cases where the children provided accurate historical information. They couldn't have learned through normal means, describing personal details about deceased individuals that were later verified through historical records. More remarkably, their future predictions showed accuracy rates that suggested they were accessing actual probability streams rather than making educated guesses. We're seeing temporal consciousness capabilities that exceed anything previously documented, Dr. Chang reported to the international consciousness research community. These children appear to experience time as a navigable dimension rather than a linear progression. The implications for our understanding of causality and free will are profound, but the children's most significant ability emerged during a crisis that tested everyone's understanding of consciousness expansion limits. A massive earthquake struck the Philippines, trapping hundreds of people beneath collapsed buildings in areas where conventional rescue operations couldn't reach them safely. The disaster presented exactly the kind of challenge that had originally brought the Consciousness Rescue Network together. However, when Sarah and the adult network members attempted to provide spiritual guidance for the rescue operations, they encountered the most sophisticated psychic interference they had ever experienced. The shadow networks had apparently developed new technologies that could block consciousness-based information gathering across entire geographic regions. As rescue operations stalled and trapped survivors began running out of time, Elena Begay and 5 other psychic children requested permission to attempt their own intervention. The idea seemed impossible. Children couldn't possibly handle the intensity of a major disaster rescue operation that was challenging even for experienced adult practitioners. But the children explained that their consciousness operated differently from adult awareness. Where adults had to work through layers of learned limitations and psychological conditioning, the children could access spiritual information directly, without the filters that made adults vulnerable to technological interference. The blocking machines can't stop us because we don't use the same pathways the grown-ups use, Eleanor told the emergency coordination team with the matter-of-fact clarity that characterized all the psychic children's communications. We go underneath, where the bad people can't see us. Against the advice of several network members who worried about exposing children to such intense trauma, Sarah authorized the experimental intervention. The children worked together in a meditation circle at the Aurora Institute, their combined consciousness reaching across the Pacific to provide guidance for rescue operations in the earthquake zone. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The children not only penetrated the psychic interference that had blocked adult practitioners, but they provided rescue teams with incredibly detailed information about survivor locations, structural stability, and optimal extraction routes. More remarkably, they maintained contact with trapped survivors, providing psychological support that helped people remain calm and conserve energy during extended rescue operations. Over 3 days of intensive spiritual work, the children guided rescue teams to 247 survivors who couldn't have been located through conventional search methods. Their success rate was higher than any adult-led operation had achieved, and they showed no signs of the psychological exhaustion that typically affected consciousness practitioners after major rescues. But the most significant discovery came when rescue teams reported that survivors frequently mentioned receiving comfort and guidance from child angels during their time trapped beneath the debris. The psychic children hadn't just provided location information, they had somehow projected their consciousness directly to trapped individuals, offering spiritual presence that sustained hope and will to survive. The children are operating at levels of consciousness expansion that we don't have adequate theoretical frameworks to understand, Dr. Foster admitted during the post-crisis analysis. They're demonstrating capabilities that suggest human potential is far greater than our current scientific models can accommodate. The Philippine earthquake rescue established the psychic children as a new category of consciousness practitioner, one that might represent humanity's next evolutionary step, but it also intensified efforts by shadow networks to recruit or capture these children for their own purposes. Intelligence reports revealed that criminal organizations were developing increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting psychically gifted children. Some groups were using advanced brain scanning technologies to detect consciousness expansion patterns in school-age populations, while others were monitoring social media and educational records for signs of unusual abilities. Sarah found herself coordinating a global protection network for psychic children, working with law enforcement agencies and child welfare organizations to identify and safeguard young people whose abilities made them targets for exploitation. The work required constant vigilance and consumed resources that might otherwise have been devoted to rescue operations. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of working with the psychic children was their consistent message about the future. In their communications with the light beings, the children received information about coming planetary changes that would require unprecedented cooperation between expanded consciousness and conventional human society. The Earth is getting ready to become something new, Eleanor explained during one of her regular consultations with Sarah. The light people say that's why we're here, to help everyone learn how to live in the new world that's coming. But first, we have to make sure the bad people don't stop the good changes from happening. The children's prophecies about planetary transformation aligned with scientific predictions about climate change, technological advancement, and social evolution. But they also included elements that couldn't be verified through conventional analysis. They spoke of consciousness itself becoming more accessible to ordinary people, of barriers between individual awareness and collective intelligence dissolving, and of humanity developing new forms of cooperation based on direct empathic connection. As Sarah reflected on the 10 years since her avalanche survival, she understood that every challenge had been preparation for this moment when humanity's consciousness evolution was accelerating beyond her ability to guide or control it. The children represented forces of change that were larger than any individual mission or organizational structure. The mountain had tested her for survival, but the real test had been whether she could adapt to serving purposes that exceeded her original understanding. Now, as consciousness expansion manifested in new generations who possessed abilities she was still learning to comprehend, Sarah realized that her role was evolving from pioneer to guardian, protecting the emerging consciousness while helping humanity navigate the most profound transformation in its evolutionary history. 15 years after her avalanche survival, Sarah Mitchell stood on the same Cascade Mountain where her journey had begun, but the world below had transformed beyond recognition. Cities now operated with consciousness-guided infrastructure that could predict and prevent disasters before they occurred. Psychic children, now teenagers, served as advisors to governments and organizations worldwide. The boundary between spiritual and scientific understanding had dissolved into a new paradigm that honored both empirical evidence and expanded awareness. The transformation hadn't come easily. The shadow networks had mounted increasingly desperate attempts to prevent consciousness evolution, culminating in what historians would call the psychic wars, a 3-year period of covert conflict between those who sought to commercialize awareness expansion and those committed to humanity's spiritual development. Joseph Begay had died peacefully 2 years earlier, but not before witnessing the establishment of consciousness expansion protocols in schools across 6 continents. His great-granddaughter Eleanor, now 16, had become the youngest member of the Global Consciousness Council, helping coordinate the integration of psychic abilities into mainstream society. And the old man would be amazed to see how far we've come, Elena told Sarah, as they prepared for the memorial ceremony that would mark the anniversary of Sarah's rescue. But he always said this was just the beginning. The real work starts now that people understand what we're capable of. The ceremony drew thousands of participants from around the world, rescue workers whose lives had been saved by consciousness-guided operations, scientists whose research had been revolutionized by psychic insights, and ordinary people who had discovered their own latent abilities through the training programs Sarah and her colleagues had developed. Dr. Foster, now director of the International Institute for Consciousness Research, presented findings that documented the global scope of humanity's transformation. Brain imaging studies showed that nearly 30% of the world's population now displayed some level of enhanced awareness, while birth rates for psychically gifted children had increased by 400% in the past decade. But the most significant change was harder to quantify. Humanity had developed what researchers called species empathy, a collective awareness that made large-scale conflicts increasingly difficult to sustain. When populations could literally feel each other's suffering across vast distances, the motivation for warfare and exploitation had largely evaporated. As Sarah looked out across the valley where she had once fought for survival, she understood that the avalanche had been more than a test of endurance. It had been the trigger for humanity's next evolutionary leap, the moment when one person's impossible survival opened pathways that allowed an entire species to transcend its limitations. The mountain had buried her old life and given birth to something unprecedented, a future where consciousness itself had become humanity's greatest tool for survival, growth, and connection. The rescue that had begun with Joseph Begay's visions had ultimately rescued not just one person, but the fundamental trajectory of human evolution. Standing where tons of snow had once entombed her, Sarah felt the presence of all those who had guided her journey: Joseph's spirit, the light beings who counseled the children, and the countless individuals whose consciousness had contributed to humanity's transformation. The avalanche had ended, but the awakening it had triggered would continue for generations yet to come. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.